Good morning. So let's get started. Welcome to the 48th Annual ARO meeting. By the way, there's lots of spaces up here in the front if you want to see better. I want to start by asking a quick question. How many of you are here for the first time? Can you stand up quickly? I just want to see you better. Right, quite a few of you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for joining us at ARO. Well, the reason I ask is because I'm going to start with my journey at ARO. I came to ARO about 35 years ago for the first time, and I've come to every single meeting except for one, because I had to go to India to my sister's wedding. But basically, while attending ARO, we started looking for postdoc jobs, and with these little red dots, and looking for people with green dots who had jobs to offer. And as Chris Scherer would like to say, sometimes we put both on to have an interesting conversation. So now those dots are actually blue and yellow, so please use them. It's really a good conversation starter. You can maybe find a job here. So I never thought I'd be standing here in front of you as your president this year. And back then we had this kind of weird looking logo, but I'm glad we have a new logo, which is also more fun and representative of our society. So I want to thank my family for their continued support to allow me to get here. I want to thank my students, current students and past students and trainees, and colleagues, both when I was at Stanford and now at Mass Eye, Eden Peabody Lab. And they've really been an integral part of everything we've really accomplished together. I thank the ARO members for voting for me, particularly my colleagues on middle ear and cochlear mechanics. They've been a really good support group. And special acknowledgement to Kristen Johnson for Parthenon Management. They really make the magic happen of ARO in the background. But I really want to concentrate a little bit on the ARO committees that really work tirelessly to keep us engaged as a community throughout the year. And I was a council liaison on the education committee, and I got to work with Kathy Sung. Kathy, are you here? I think she's not here because she's actually at NIH, so unfortunately she couldn't make it. But they put together the coffee hour, the workshops, lots of different events throughout the year that are really, kind of special as a community. So I also want to thank all the other committee members. There's a whole bunch of committees that are listed here that do a lot of things in the background. Are the committee chairs actually here? I would like to see you stand up to be acknowledged. I think there's a few of you guys here. Thank you. And who are the committee members? If the committee members could all stand. Some of you are here, some of you are not. There's some there. So all the committee members, there you are. You all worked so hard throughout the year to make these events happen, and I think that's really how ARO comes together. So I'm going to switch to talking about JARO. JARO is our society journal, and this is the 25th anniversary of JARO, right? That's our society journal, Journal of ARO. And so I figured I'd do a little history of JARO, right? The whole idea was conceived by Jerry Popelka of this idea of a peer-reviewed ARO publication back in 1996. And he and Jerry and Art Popper got together. Art Popper is the editor-in-chief of the Shar series books, so he knew about publishing. So they formed a committee. They presented it to ARO Council. Council liked it, and ARO put it to vote for the ARO membership, and we jointly agreed to have a society journal. So JARO was formed with the guiding principles of that the publisher had to provide funding for the editorial office, the copyright had to be owned by ARO, and the editor had to be selected by ARO, and we had complete control over the journal content. So it was important. And the goal was really to accept manuscripts on original experimental theoretical studies of, lots of range of topics that we study here in hearing, balance, and chemical senses. And so Richard Cole, the president back then, signed the contract with Springer, and JARO was formed. And the first issue was published exactly in March of 2025, just a few weeks from now. And the first editor-in-chief was Eric Young. And he really brought this journal up. And by the way, Eric Young passed away. There's a memorial session dedicated to him later today. I think it's one of these rooms here. So if you can attend, that'll be great. Then Ruth Ann was the editor-in-chief. She was at the helm for 5-6 years. And then Paul Manis was there for like 11 years, which is amazing. And then currently, Christoph Sedorov is the current editor-in-chief. So one of the fun things about Jaro I like is their beautiful covers. And in fact, I love submitting to Jaro because there's an opportunity to get on the cover of Jaro, right? And here's two of our journal papers. The one on the right is work I did in Tony Ricci's lab using his 2-photon imaging to look at the cytoarchitecture of the mouse organ of Corti. And then when I moved to Boston at Eden Peabody Lab, I got an OTT imaging system, which I learned from John Ogilvie about. And then, so we imaged the gerbil, 3-dimensional gerbil anatomy in the basal turn of the cochlea. So that was cool. So Jaro continues to cover all fields presented at ARO, from animal acoustics to humans. Has very broad editorial coverage. And new this year is that all of our titles from this meeting are published in a supplement that was published at the end of January. So that's new. Jaro's on the rise. We had more publications last year than previous years, and we have well over 250,000 downloads of our papers. So that's great. But one thing you should know about is, publishing is a business, right? But unlike many other journals, because we're a society journal, we get some of that funding back to us. So they give us back some of the money, and that income helps us keep our registration fees down and hopefully go to cheaper places. Not a lot of money, but it's some funding that comes back to us. So you can help the ARO Society really by publishing your ARO presentations in Jaro. And this year we're going to have the presidential speakers submit a manuscript for their presentations, and they'll be published in Jaro as like review articles. Please read Jaro and cite Jaro. That helps the impact factor. And we're really here to help. Christoph Sedorov, he's around. I'm around. Other people are around. They'll help you if you have questions about publishing Jaro. OK, so now let's switch topics to the Presidential Symposium today. So our title is Innovations, Challenges, and Personalization in Hearing Aids. And hearing aids are really the standard of care for most people with sensory neural hearing loss. There's over 20 million devices sold annually, globally, and this number is really expected to grow a lot. And with the advent of the discovery of synaptopathy or hidden hearing loss, by Charlie Lieberman and Sharon Kujawa and Stefan Maison at EPL, and new technologies like deep neural network, machine learning, and AI approaches, it's really causing a paradigm shift in how people think about hearing aids. So I thought it was appropriate to have this presidential symposium dedicated to hearing aids. So we have really an amazing set of speakers today. First one is going to be Mara Mills from NYU. She's in the Media Studies Department, and she's going to, Thomas Edison did so many things, but he apparently also worked on hearing aids. So she's going to take us through his discoveries in hearing aids. Brian C.J. Moore, many of you know him. Probably you have a book from him on your desk or your bookshelf. He's probably one of the most prolific authors I know in terms of, I think he has, last time I looked, it was more than 500 publications. It's probably like 7 by now, 700. In referee journals, yes. But Brian Moore also has been wearing a hearing aid for several decades. So I thought it'd be a good idea to have a psychoacoustician tell us about his experiences with a hearing device. And then we have Torsten Dow from Danish Technical University, and he's going to talk about how to improve hearing aids based on the scene and the cocktail party problem, and compensations based on modeling. And we'll take a short break, a coffee break for about 10 minutes. We'll come back at 10 o'clock. And then we'll have a presentation by Sarah Verhulst, and she's going to look at synaptopathy and personalization and using cochlear models and machine learning approaches to hearing compensation. And then, of course, I couldn't have a session about hearing aids without somebody from hearing aid industry. And Stefan Launer is the vice president of research, and he's been there for many, many decades. And he's done some amazing work on deep neural network-based algorithms for speech enhancement in hearing aids. And finally, a little bit of futuristic ideas from Nima Mezgarani. He's in the EE department at Columbia University, and he's going to talk about real-time brain-controlled hearing, and how you can use concepts of attention decoding for better hearing and noise problems. So with that, I will then we'll stop. After the presentations, we'll have a panel discussions. You can ask more questions. So talks are 25 minutes with 5 minutes questions, and then we can come back and ask more questions at the end. Okay? So with that, I will switch over to our first speaker, Mara Mills. That's correct. All right. So Mara is an associate professor in the Media, Culture, and Communications at NYU. And I met Mara at the Mechanics of Hearing meeting, and it was quite fortunate because she, amazingly enough, is a historian of acoustics and studies cochlear implant and hearing aids. She told me she went to the Bell Labs archives where I was a PhD student, and I was really pleasantly surprised to hear that somebody concentrates on this. So please, Mara, take it away.
Yeah, I'm your historian. There is a historian. Actually, there's several of us who are historians of otolaryngology and also electronics that are related to cochlear implants, hearing aids, and I'm one of those people. And I'm embarrassed to say that I am a first-timer at this conference, and I should have come to it a long, long time ago. I know several of you in the audience from other conferences or just from reaching out to you for tips or archives or collaboration, and I'm really delighted to be here today. Hopefully this sounds very echoey to me. Let me push this back a little bit. And also, yeah, let me just say I'm grateful to Dr. Puria for inviting me to kick off the Aero Conference and this presidential symposium on hearing aids. I'm going to briefly take us back to the early days of electroacoustics around the turn of the 20th century. If you're getting horrified flashbacks to like 8 a.m. history class in secondary school, don't worry, I won't. I'm your historian. It won't be it won't be awful like that. And also, I should say, by way of introduction, I trained in biology. I have a bachelor's and master's in biology, and then I switched fields into history of science, where I got my PhD. Now, when Dr. Puria first invited me to participate, the tentative title of this panel was Deep Listening, Innovations in Hearing Aids Through Time and Technology. And I came up with the title and the topic of my paper based on that panel title. I instantly thought about research I had done but never published in Thomas Edison's massive archives, where some 5 million pages of material are preserved. This is at the Edison National Historic Park in New Jersey. Let me give a shout out to our beleaguered national parks staff in the United States right now. A fraction of Edison's collection of acoustic horns is pictured on this slide in one of the rooms of his main laboratory building. He used these horns for mechanical phonograph amplification, but being hard of hearing himself, he would also hold one against his ear and press it against the piano to listen through bone conduction, something he did regularly. So my research focuses on the history of assistive technology, especially electroacoustic technology, as Sunil mentioned, to some extent the history of medicine and otolaryngology. I thought that I had met Dr. Puria last year at the Mechanics of Hearing conference, where I gave a talk on a 1970s joint Bell Labs Stanford experiment at the origin of the first multi-channel cochlear implant. But actually, Sunil, do you remember that we met in 2011? I was looking through my email while writing to you about Aero, and I realized that you attended one of my first professional talks at Stanford in 2011. The talk became this publication. I was just transitioning from a postdoc into my current professorship at NYU, and I'd been working on convincing my colleagues in history of technology, a field really dominated by the history of computing, that hearing aids mattered, that no one was working on hearing aids. No one thought it was a topic worth writing a history of. I had a peer reviewer rejected this. Since then, it's won a prize in my field, but I had to really push to convince people that hearing aids were significant to the history of electronics and to the history of digital coding and to things that would eventually become computing. So this talk I gave at Stanford, Sunil, you wrote to me after the talk, and I totally forgot that exchange. And the article that I published, basically I make an argument that hearing aids were the consumer device at the forefront of electronics miniaturization from the era of carbon telephone amplifiers through subminiature vacuum tubes, all the way into the first printed circuits and the first integrated circuits, so like 7 decades of the 20th century. And I won't say more about it, you can find the article yourself, but there are a lot of people working on the history of hearing aids now. It's become a robust subfield, but it wasn't, and history of technology is a small field, and people tend to cluster around things that seem like big tech. Hearing aids are big tech, but it took a little convincing for me to explain that to some of my colleagues. So an outtake of that project, which never made it into print, was my work in the Edison archives, which turns out to be a really important repository for disability history as a consequence of the massive correspondence that Edison's fame encouraged. His archive contains the letters of hundreds of deaf and hard of hearing people worldwide who wrote to him about their hopes, their fears, and their experiences with hearing aid technology. By my count, in the weeks that I spent in West Orange, New Jersey, and his archive, people wrote to him at least every week or two from around the world, from, of course, across North America, across Europe. Pictured here is a letter about a deafened telegraph operator in Berlin beseeching Edison to invent an aid that would help her. People wrote from India, Australia, Suriname, and what was then called Rhodesia, and beyond. It's this fabulous disability history and hearing aid user experience history collection, unintentionally. That's not what Edison or the National Park Service thought they were preserving. So on the one hand, his collection for a social historian like myself, it's a really rare place where you can see documentation of the history of listening. It's always difficult to find any firsthand accounts of everyday people's lives in archives. Those aren't the kind most people don't preserve correspondence, they don't keep diaries, and they don't have enough money or power to have their records preserved. But even the handful of people who did keep diaries, they very rarely wrote about hearing. People very rarely document their hearing and their listening experiences. There are medical records, for instance, the records of otolaryngologists. I've found some pockets of those in archives. They're not always easy to access for privacy reasons, and they're not always preserved. And by the mid-20th century, most corporate archives are just not open to the public at all. And eventually, in the late 20th century, you get to the point of scientists signing NDAs. It gets harder and harder to do the history of technology as you get closer to the present. So in this crucial time period at the origin of electroacoustics, the sort of after the invention of the telephone, to understand people's experiences with the cutting edge technology of the day and the new universe of electrical and amplified sounds, what we have are some telegraph and telephone operator records, some radio archives, And then we also have a bunch of repositories of hearing aid listening, but none are as extensive as Edison's archive. So crucially, Edison's correspondence also reveals the abundant expertise and inventiveness of deaf and hard of hearing people beyond himself in the early 20th century. Of course, the same is true today, and I know that there's a subgroup here of people who've reached out to me who are part of a deaf and hard of hearing otolaryngology group, and I look forward to hanging out with you later today. So in the early 20th century, people weren't just writing to Edison to seek help and advice from him as a famous inventor. They were also offering him their inventions and offering him advice. Among those of us who work on disability in the history of science and technology, what we call disability expertise is currently a very active analytic approach. And here I'm showing the cover of a special issue of my society's big journal, Osiris, Journal of the History of Science Society. This is from last summer, that I edited with Jaypreet Verdi, who couldn't join us today, a hard of hearing historian of hearing aids and my frequent collaborator, and Sarah Rose. And it's on disability in the history of science. It features a cover image, How to Measure Loudness, by deaf artist Christine Sun Kim. And we talk about disability expertise in our introduction. It refers to the knowledge, skills, methods, and technical innovations arising from experiences of illness and impairment, also arising from community relations, activism, creative responses to misfit in an ableist built environment. And it also involves the kind of insight about social or infrastructural norms that comes from exclusion. As philosopher Sandra Harding has argued, one often sees better from a standpoint of oppression. So what's at stake for historians in writing narratives that highlight disability expertise, which, as I've found, is really hearing aid expertise among a range of disabled people is really documented in the Edison archives, is that we, historians of medicine and science, have mostly over the decades portrayed disability and disabled people as the objects of investigation. Scientists, seemingly non-disabled, often not, manufacture and mine impairments, or they test disabled people in our narratives for insights into physiology, but we haven't imagined disability and disabled people to be the seat of insight itself, and that's a problem internal to my field. And I would say that, disabled people are extremely underrepresented still in the scientific professions today. This is another stake of resuscitating disability expertise in history. A statistic from a 2012, so 10 years ago, so out-of-date NSF publication, states that 27.1% of people living in the US have a disability, as compared to only 9 to 10% of students at the undergrad level, 5% at the grad level, and 1% at the doctoral level. So this is from the National Science Foundation. The current threats against what DEIA fail to recognize that the A, accessibility, has always been a bipartisan effort, but it also has not gone nearly far enough in the science and technology professions, thinking of those statistics. So the purpose of my talk is not to add to the Edison hagiography by giving you some snippets from his archive. And if you're a Nikola Tesla fan in the audience, you'll be relieved that I'm not just lauding Edison. But I want to leverage the Edison archive to just offer you a few examples, one of hearing aids as important sites of early electroacoustic listening, and two of hearing aids as sites of invention by deaf and hard of hearing experts, whether they were forgotten deaf engineers or just lay experts, everyday people who gained lay expertise in science and technology. So deaf and hard of hearing people around the world were reaching out to Edison, not only because of his status as arguably the most famous US inventor of his time, but also because he experienced and talked a lot about his own hearing loss. In his speeches, in his private records, he sometimes described himself as deaf, sometimes partially deaf, half deaf, hard of hearing. Why all of these phrases? He lived at the exact moment when the centuries-long binary between hearing and deafness shifted into a spectrum of many different kinds and gradations of hearing loss. One, because of the development of electrical and then electronic audiometry and the creation of an audiogram. I've written articles on the history of both of those things. I've also written on the history of speech audiometry. And two, because of the development of electrical and then vacuum tube hearing aids, which allowed people who might previously have been called deaf to hear some sounds and to be reclassified or reclassify themselves. So in fact, when the first commercial electronic audiometer was built at Bell Labs in New York, it was still in New York in 1922, Edison was one of the first visitors for an audiometric exam. He felt that he was deaf in his left ear and hard of hearing in his right ear, and he was delighted when Harvey Fletcher, who is the head of speech and hearing research at the labs, told him that his hearing loss in the right ear was evenly distributed across the frequency range, because he took that to mean that he was still a good judge of distortion in recorded sound. And his staff at his lab had been accusing him for years of misinterpreting the quality of the phonograph records they pressed. So after his exam, his foreman, who was one of those people and who thought of himself as a hearing person who would be better to do this job than Edison, he went to Bell Labs to have his own hearing tested. He wanted to prove to Edison that he should be the final judge of the pressed recordings, but as it turned out, he found out that he had a hearing loss above 2,000 hertz. So I bring this up to just say hearing loss was and is incredibly common. And Edison was living at this moment where hearing identities were being reshuffled and audiometry was becoming professionalized. Actually, let me go back. So Edmund Morris's best-selling recent biography of Edison, and there's so many biographies of Edison. This one's about 5 years old. He opens with a discussion of Edison's obituaries, which marveled that, and here's a quote, "An acoustic revolution adding a whole new dimension to human memory could have been accomplished by a man half deaf in one ear and wholly deaf in another." In addition to light bulbs and silent film and all of his visual inventions, Edison invented well over 200 acoustic devices, the phonograph, dictating machines, acoustic clocks, talking dolls. And the press, in his own time as well as now, tend to repeatedly mention his so-called deafness as paradoxical in a actually patronizing mode that my colleague Rosemary Garland Thompson calls wondrous rhetoric, or like supercrip rhetoric, with praise for either seeming to overcome a disability or have special powers because of one. Today in my field, people who analyze disability expertise instead strive for realism. And I'll say one can get a sense of Edison as hard of hearing, but far from an isolated genius as these obituaries seem to portray him, from documentaries made of him collaborating with large teams in his lab. And I'll just play a few seconds of this. It's a silent film from 1922. Okay, so not the sort of isolated, working alone, so-called deaf genius as he's often portrayed. There's also a legend in the annals of history that Edison lost his hearing from being boxed in the ears as a child after setting fire on a train. But we know from the archives that he probably had familial hearing loss. Both his father and his son Charles had a very similar hearing impairment to him. Charles endorsed various hearing aids throughout his life. Here's an image of him modeling for Zenith. The founder of Zenith was also hearing impaired himself. Here he's modeling a Zenith hearing aid at one point in his life. And despite Edison's long list of acoustic patents, there's another myth that he never tried to invent hearing aids himself. That's simply not true. In 1878, for starters, like before electrical hearing aids, he was working on hearing trumpets. He attached a 7-foot tunnel to a speaking trumpet and found that he could broadcast speech 2 miles. He called this a megaphone, and he believed its function could be reversed to create a telescopophone for either detecting faraway sounds or, as he mentioned in a circular that he sent out to colleagues that year, as something that could be adapted into a hearing aid. So he wrote in that circular, "I have now 2 assistants engaged in my lab in experimenting upon an apparatus based on this for the benefit of the deaf. The results have been quite satisfactory. The only drawback is the large size of the apparatus, hardly portable, a giant megaphone." Perhaps more importantly, the carbon transmitter Edison invented as a telephone amplifier enabled the electrical hearing aid industry to come into being in the first place, even if he didn't successfully market an electrical aid himself. And he attributed the carbon transmitter to his own hearing loss. In one publication he wrote, "When Bell first worked out his telephone idea, I tried it and the sound which came through the instrument was so weak I couldn't hear it. I started to develop it and I kept on until the sounds were audible to me. The telephone as we now know it might have been delayed if a deaf electrician had not undertaken the job of making it a practical thing." So before vacuum tubes, there had to be a way to either amplify or preserve sounds using batteries or carbon mics and carbon mic repeaters. Edison also wrote in 1881 to aurist James Alexander Campbell, a term used before otolaryngology, that, quote, "he had been trying a great many experiments to develop an electrical hearing aid, but none have been sufficiently satisfactory to make a commercial introduction." That said, many other inventors immediately began adapting Edison's carbon transmitter in combination with batteries or headsets or earphones into hearing aid amplifiers that actually were marketed. Miller Reese Hutchison built what I think was the first carbon telephone aid in 1898. It was called the Accuphone. He then became chief engineer at Edison Labs for a decade, after which he left, moved to New York, and founded Hutchison's Acoustic Company, which went on to spawn some of the leading hearing aid firms of the 20th century, starting with Acousticon. I know some of you know this history yourselves. There's more to be said about Hutchison. I'm not going to do it here because he was one of the hearing employees working on hearing aids at Edison's labs. Edison did repeatedly recommend the Acousticon device in his replies to the queries that came in for people asking what brand of hearing aid he recommended, and it was this one. Edison also hired deaf engineers to work for him at Edison Labs in West Orange, New Jersey. I'll give you just one example. William Shaw of Lynn, Massachusetts. He was a deaf experimenter, a General Electric employee who made everything from visual doorbells to baby minders for deaf people, amplifiers, and he became famous for a so-called talkless telephone in 1912 that was something like teletype. It was a precursor to teletype, which is something like a precursor to the internet. He attached a typewriter to a phone line as the sender and a board with letters that lit up in sequence at the receiver. And when Edison learned of this invention, he invited Shaw to move to New Jersey to join his lab. 5 years later, he asked Shaw to establish a large team of deaf employees at the lab. So in 1918, Shaw wrote in a news announcement that went out on the East Coast in a number of newspapers that a request for people to apply for these jobs. Shaw wrote, they have a certain kind of light work in the Edison laboratory for only, and I'll put this in quotes, old-fashioned language, for which only deaf mutes are wanted. They will employ 100 or more by summer if the plan is successful. For unknown reasons, which Shaw simply described as friction in his correspondence, which is in the Edison archives, he doesn't have his own archive, the plan for a team of deaf engineers working at the Edison labs fell apart by February, and Shaw and all of the other deaf people who had been hired dispersed. Shaw moved back to Massachusetts. So this is just a reminder that Edison hardly represents all deaf people or even all deaf inventors of his time, and he even had vexed relations with some of his deaf colleagues. In 2019, an author writing for British, so recently, Shaw has been resuscitated. An author writing for British Deaf News described him as, quote, the greatest capital D deaf inventor, someone who knew sign language and was a member of the deaf community, unlike Edison. So possibly we'll hear more about Shaw in the future. It's also often said that Edison never even used an electrical hearing aid, that he preferred silence and isolation as as a boon to his so-called genius. This is also totally not true. He used many, many different kinds of hearing aids. There's abundant documentation of them. After his hearing, I'll just give you a couple of examples. After his hearing test at Bell Labs, Harvey Fletcher at the labs built 2 customized aids for him and brought them to his office. One was small, not pictured here. It was components packed into a foot-long case, attached to a microphone and a headset. Edison used it for several years. He would carry it to dinner parties and lectures. He reported back to Fletcher, with the hearing aid, I can hear and understand the speaker, but if I find it dull, I turn it off and turn my thoughts to my inventions. So maybe some of you are tuning out right now too. I also came across this photo in the Bell Labs archives, so not the Edison archives, but the Bell Labs one. This one had no explanation. It's just labeled a deaf set amplifier built for Thomas Edison. So there were multiple aids designed for him. And across his life, as I found in his archives, he was profusely interested in a wide range of aids, some of which were utterly speculative. He was in frequent correspondence with Hugo Gernsback, an inventor, the editor of Astounding Science Fiction, an editor of Electrical Experimenter, a sort of all-around electrical enthusiast. He wrote to him in 1920 regarding one of Gernsback's inventions. And his assistant actually said, Mr. Edison would be very glad to try this out himself. I believe this was the Physiophone because that was what was publicized in 1920, right at that time. It used a microphone to supposedly, I think this was purely speculative, to transform sound from a record player into electrical current, and then passed it to charged metal handles. And by grasping the handles, a listener could experience what Gernsback called physiological music as a pattern of electrical shocks. And Gernsback predicted that deaf people in the future would wear metallic bracelets that would give them these electrical shocks. But Edison wanted to try this out. So I don't have time to go through it, but I'll just say his manuscript collection, again, it's 5 million documents. I didn't look at all of them in 3 weeks, hardly. But there were many, among what I looked at, there were many other examples of ways he learned to communicate either through amplified hearing or beyond hearing. He had a lot of correspondence with William Terry and his descendants about the touch alphabet, pictured here. He and Hutchison collaborated via Morse code, tapped out on each other's knees or wrists. He also did this with his wife. And just as important as all of his experiments with hearing aids and the deaf inventors he hired to work for him, for a social historian like myself, are the prolific examples in his archives of everyday people who wrote into him. So first, all of the accounts of listening experiences through hearing aids of everyday people around the world trying out hearing aids at that moment. Again, we don't, as historians of technology, don't know much about what when people ask me, what did I work a lot in Bell Labs archives, my students will say, what did the telephone sound like in 1915? I mean, it partly depended on where you were, how long distance the call was, what the weather was that day, but we don't have many records of this. So it's fascinating as a hearing aid historian to understand hearing aid listening, but it's also fascinating in terms of broader, what did early electronics sound like? We're still in an electronic moment. So let me just give you a couple out of like the literally hundreds of examples. Miss Letty Watkins, writing in from Oakland in November 1920, told Edison about her, quote, problems with street use of a carbon transmitter, which he had invented, because she said all other sounds besides speech were magnified. I'm sure that sounds familiar to many of you. You know, this is a problem with hearing aids for a lot of the 20th century. Beyond background noise, Gordon Bloomfeld of Sinclairville, New York, wrote in August 1919 of the distortion caused by the electronic components of the aids themselves. He said, I've tried some of the miniature telephones that one carries in the pocket. They give every voice a kind of foreign brogue, and they make music a confused medley. This kind of distortion from electronic components was a similar problem for landline phones at the time. And then finally, in this very detailed letter pictured on this slide, Roger Tracy wrote from Massachusetts in 1911 with a complaint about electrical aids, quote, sounding like a megaphone in a railroad waiting room. They're loud enough, but they have a hollow booming quality which results in jumbling everything up. And he went on the second page to describe his own plan for inventing a wearable set of ear trumpets with like a stethoscope like contraption for leaving the hands free, but he said he regretted that he did not have, quote, the material resources for experimenting. And indeed, Edison's correspondence reveals abundant inventiveness and lay expertise of so many deaf and hard of hearing people who had far fewer resources than him and couldn't either bring their plans to fruition, or if they did, they only had a prototype, they couldn't bring them to market, and even had far fewer resources than Shaw, people whose names and ideas have otherwise been lost to the historical record. I'll show you two examples before closing. On this slide is a 1920 letter from a man whose adult deaf daughter listened to phonograph records through a bespoke bone conduction apparatus, a sort of wire and pencil held through the teeth. Here, Ernest Rose of Montreal describes his success in 1912 at bringing out a new conversation tube. He says he marketed it. I haven't been able to find any other record besides this one in Edison's collection of the device. And as a final example, writing from Whittier, California in 1914, a deaf woman offers a sketch of her idea for a wearable battery-powered hybrid amplifier and bone conduction device that had in-the-ear and skull components. So to listen through hearing aids with Thomas Edison, the title of my talk, at the start of electroacoustics, is on the one hand to hear his idiosyncratic perspective from a position of deaf fame, vast technical elitism and access, but it's also to witness forgotten deaf and hard of hearing expertise with hearing aids, which, like all lay innovation, participates in a hierarchy of expertise involving scientists, engineers, and corporations and other powerful actors. In fact, powerful actors, including disabled ones like Edison, routinely incorporate or employ the disability expertise of others by patenting, pirating, commandeering, collaborating, testing, and otherwise capitalizing on the experiential knowledge and disabled labor of others. And perhaps this is what we see in the unequal battle for the title of greatest deaf inventor that's brewing right now between Edison and Shaw. Thanks.
We have microphones. Anybody have a question for Mara?
We can take a couple now, and then we'll do the
Yeah,
panel
we can do
panel
some at the
thing.
Q&A also, but no? Well, one thing I have to say that I do remember reading an article about the idea of the first use, but it was by you, first use of the vacuum. Like when they invented Shockley invented the transistor, they didn't know what to do. The vacuum tubes worked really well, but yet they didn't know what to do with this miniaturized transistor, and hearing aids
Yeah.
was one of the first applications.
Well, yeah, so AT&T had, because of the connection, AT&T had emerged as the long distance company for Boston Telephone, which was founded by Alexander Graham Bell, and then it spun off and became its own company, moved to New York. But because of their ties to Bell, they had a long-standing tradition of free licensing of their components for any applications for deaf or hard of hearing people. So transistors were, germanium transistors were given free licenses, and there was a sense that wealthy hard of hearing and deaf people would be willing to pay a high price for components that might be mediocre. So like Sonotone brought out germanium transistor hearing aids and charged a lot of money for them, and in effect, the hearing aid users who used those were like the guinea pigs that proved that germanium was not good, and it didn't work as well as silicon did, and it was susceptible to problems from heating up and moisture and things like that. So yeah, the first commercial application of the transistor was hearing aid use. AT&T wanted something to replace. They had millions of vacuum tubes in repeaters in telephone lines, and it was really a pain in the neck because, of course, they blew out, they overheated. So they did want a different sort of material substrate than a glass light bulb. But that wasn't but they needed to perfect it, and they basically used the hearing aid industry as a test group.
You are such a wealth of knowledge about this. Thank you very much for this amazing presentation. I really enjoyed it.
There might be two other questions. Do you want to wait?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see that. Go ahead.
Sorry. Is this on? Yes. Thank you, Mara. That was a fascinating story. I think it's wonderful that we're having these kinds of conversations at ARO, at this conference. My question is not very well formed, but I was wondering, because you presented this case of two different inventors, one who is maybe more embedded in the deaf community than the other, I was wondering if there was anything in the archival work that you've done that shows a difference in the language that is used to describe the technologies and the people that are using them. In the archives in between the two different inventors or similar inventors.
Yeah, so this is this moment of like this proliferation of vocabulary for hearing impairment. In fact, I just wrote an article with a life insurance historian, former mathematician Dan Book, on the history of the word impairment. So if you really want to know, that happens at the same moment too. One thing I've been puzzling over is, so Shaw was very embedded in the deaf community in Massachusetts. He was a widower, but both of his wives were deaf. He knew sign language. He was very active in an ASL community. In some respects, he and Edison both used the word deaf in some context to describe themselves, but Edison also used a range of other terms. What's interesting is that Edison was able to capitalize on that term and gain like this overcoming narrative glory through it. And I feel that a lot of the accounts of Shaw were more stigmatizing, and even if it was the same word that was being used. It's true that he also was sometimes described as, quote, as deaf mute, or described himself that way, which was a different term and one we don't use anymore. But I've been puzzling a little bit about how Edison was able to do that. He was very embedded in the hearing world, and he had a very, very different relationship to the hearing world than Shaw would have had. So, yeah, there's a more condescending approach to Shaw in the newspaper, and a more articles I've read, and a more lionizing approach to Edison. And I'm not sure if this is just because Edison was Edison and became so famous and powerful and that was just not, he's a case of one. Or if this is a moment where certain hard of hearing people were manipulating the terminology of deafness to get a sense of like superpower credit, whereas other people who were deaf couldn't do that. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I have been puzzling over this. Yeah.
No, thank you. It's potentially a conversation we could continue at a later time, but that was very helpful.
Yeah.
Yes.
And Shaw's archives don't exist. So he had dozens and dozens of patents, but historians help to make people famous. And if someone's archive doesn't exist, we don't write about them. We can't. So Edison, it's like there's millions of biographies of him. He did do a lot of things. Apologies to all of the Nikola Tesla fans. But he also kept his records, and they're now a national park, a national historic site.
All right, we're going to have to give Mara a hand. We'll have more time, Carl, for questions later. Now, I think Brian Moore needs really no introduction to this audience, but so I'm going to just let him go because we're running on time. But I've known Brian since I was a postdoc. We've published together a few papers. I've contributed to one or two to his 700 publications. So I'll let you get on. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. Okay, so this is moving to the present day, and what I'm going to be talking about is based partly on research findings, both in the literature and work that I've done myself on technical measurements, which we did a lot of, and my own personal experience with hearing aids over the last 25 years. And I've tried most of the brands that are out there, and sometimes many models within a brand. So I've got a lot of personal experience. And I should say, in my youth, when I started off doing hearing research, I had two perfectly good ears, pretty much 0 dB across the whole range. Now I'm completely deaf in one ear due to an acoustic neuroma, so I don't get any binaural benefits, and I'm mainly going to be focusing on monaural aspects today. I want, first of all, to just address one basic factor of hearing aid performance that is often ignored, and that's to do with the way that the hearing aid is coupled to the ear. And broadly speaking, you can say that there are two types of fittings. There's a closed fitting where you have a seal in the ear canal, often with a receiver or miniature loudspeaker in the ear canal that generates the sound. But if you have a completely sealed fitting, then you get something called the occlusion effect, where the user's own voice sounds too loud or too boomy, and self-generated sounds like chewing sound too loud and are rather objectionable. At the other extreme, you can have a so-called open fitting where the ear tip has a vent or several vents or openings, and that alleviates the occlusion effect, but it has some undesirable other effects. One effect is to do with the fact that some sound gets into the ear canal via the vent and some gets into the ear canal through the hearing aid. The sound through the hearing aid is delayed by some milliseconds, and the interaction of the delayed and the non-delayed sound creates ripples in the frequency response that's often referred to as comb filtering, and that degrades sound quality. A second undesirable effect is that with an open fitting, it's very difficult to produce sufficient gain at low frequencies. And so the response rolls off below about 1,000 hertz. And the third problem with an open fitting is that the sound passing through the vent reduces any possible benefits from directional processing and noise reduction. And that's something we'll hear a lot more about in this symposium. You can have super fancy processing in your hearing aid that would take away all background noise, but if the noise is leaking through the vent, you've lost that benefit entirely. Now, of course, there are degrees of openness. You can vary how open the vent is and try and get a compromise between these two things, but it is a compromise, and that's something I'll come back to later on. And it is the case today that most people with mild to moderate hearing losses get open fittings. That's generally what's done. It's by far the greatest practice. The only exception, as far as I can tell, is in Japan, where people routinely are given a closed fitting and told to live with the occlusion effect. But there you go, that's a cultural thing, I guess. So I want now to talk about just some very basic properties of hearing aids. And now, of course, a basic requirement is to improve audibility via amplification over a wide frequency range. I once bought a hearing aid made in Russia for about $20 and found that it produced 10 dB of gain at 1,000 hertz and attenuated everything below 700 and above 1,500 hertz. So it wasn't a very good hearing aid. You want a wide frequency range. Now, in many hearing aids, the gain rolls off at about 5 kilohertz at the high frequency end, and that's still common today. Here's an example of a typical hearing aid showing its output in response to a speech-shaped noise input with 3 different levels, but you can see that rapid roll-off at the high frequencies, and that's pretty common. And I believe that that's lower than optimal. I've cited a number of studies looking into this, and I think it is the case that people prefer a wider bandwidth, a wider frequency range, if you get the amount of amplification exactly right. If you have too much gain at high frequencies, people will say it sounds horribly tinny and unpleasant, and they don't like the sound quality. So you've got to get the amplification just right, but when you do, wide bandwidth is preferable. Now, as I mentioned earlier, for hearing aids with open fittings, the gain also falls off below about 800 hertz, except for one device called the ear lens device, which I tried for a while, but I won't talk about it here. So again, you've got a less than optimal frequency range. With an open fitting, if you were to transmit a sound just through the hearing aid, like a phone signal or a music signal, you're only getting stuff between 800 and 5,000. It sounds pretty lousy. It's not a good sound quality. Okay. So overall, I would say, even in the basic field of amplification over a wide frequency range, the current score is on average about 6 out of 10. Okay, I want next to talk about automatic gain control, also called amplitude compression. And pretty much every hearing aid has some form of frequency-dependent amplitude compression to squeeze the wide range of sound levels we encounter in everyday life into the limited dynamic range of the hearing impaired ear. So it's well known that hearing loss is associated with a reduced dynamic range, also referred to as loudness recruitment. That's a complementary description. In my case, up at around 6 or 8 kilohertz, my range between the threshold for detecting sounds and the point where things get uncomfortable is only about 15 dB. So I need a lot of compression to squeeze things into that narrow dynamic range. Now, manufacturers' fitting software usually lets you select the gains or program the gains at each of several center frequencies. And usually you set the gains for a low level like 50 dB input and for a high level like 80 dB, and that indirectly sets the compression ratio. Now, it's my belief that users with small dynamic ranges, like me, may require compression ratios up to 10. I had a hand in the programming software for the ear lens device that I mentioned, and I persuaded them to actually let you go up to 20. And for the highest frequencies, I had it programmed with a compression ratio of 17. Most manufacturers limit the compression ratio to 3, and even when their fitting software tells you you're getting 3 or more, you usually get less than that. And I think that that's not enough compression. It doesn't allow weak sounds to be audible while preventing intense sounds from becoming uncomfortably loud. And in many hearing aids, if you program it within the limitations of the fitting software, you get a positive gain for speech even at very high levels, where many people would prefer attenuation, and you actually get a benefit from attenuation for very high levels because of an effect called a rollover. Even for many hearing impaired people get reduced intelligibility of speech, especially in noise, when the level gets too high. So for very high input levels, you want a hearing aid that attenuates rather than amplifiers, and many hearing aids just don't do that. And of course, an open fitting won't let you do it either. So the score there, also only moderate, 6 out of 10, I'm afraid, for that. One aspect of amplitude compression is compression speed. Hearing aids vary in how fast the gain changes in response to a change in the input level, and I'll refer to that generically as the compression speed. Now, some manufacturers allow compression speed to be programmed, but they have very vague descriptors in the software, so the dispenser has no idea what they're really doing when they adjust those things. Many manufacturers have their own proprietary compression systems that use multiple time constants, but you're never quite sure how they work, and you can spend hours playing around with different kinds of sounds trying to figure out what that compression system is actually doing. Now, in theory, you would like fast compression to compensate for the loss of fast-acting compression in the cochlea. Loudness recruitment behaves like a very fast-acting expander, and so in theory, you would like fast compression to compensate for that. But in practice, fast compression itself introduces some bad effects, some side effects of various kinds. So many manufacturers mainly use slow compression to avoid these deleterious effects. Now, one of these deleterious effects is something that we like to call cross-modulation. Imagine that you have two people talking in the outside world and their voices are completely independent and have independent amplitude fluctuation patterns. When you put them through a fast-acting compressor, the gain goes up and down together for both speech sounds, and you get a common pattern of modulation superimposed on the sounds. That's what we call cross-modulation, and that makes it harder to perceptually segregate the sounds and reduces the intelligibility of speech in noise and generally degrades sound quality. And a potential solution to that is to use a deep neural network to separate target speech from background sounds and apply compression independently to the target and the background. And I mentioned one study that's just recently been published on this, where I was loosely involved. And we've shown that that led to preferred sound quality by hearing impaired people. They like that kind of compression over various other types of compression that we tried. But this is not yet available in a hearing aid, but I think is an approach that might be of interest in the future. But again, the score for current AG systems is still only modest. There's still a lot of room for improvement. If you have a moderate to severe hearing loss, you might need quite a high gain to restore the audibility of soft sounds, and that can lead to acoustic feedback, also called howling or whistling, especially at high frequencies. And this has been a known problem for many years, and most hearing aids nowadays incorporate systems for reducing or cancelling acoustic feedback. And often there's two aspects to that. There's a static cancellation system that you measure and set up when you're fitting the hearing aid. There's special test signals for measuring the feedback path and devising a cancellation signal. And then there's an adaptive system to deal with changes in the feedback path as you move around. For example, if you stand near a wall or hold a telephone to your ear or something like that. And sometimes a small frequency shift is introduced to decorrelate the input and the output. Feedback cancellers introduce artifacts of various types that degrade sound quality, especially for music. And I've listed some of those here. The extent of these does vary a lot across manufacturers. Some have got this problem cracked better than others, but most feedback cancellers still introduce some artifacts if you listen carefully to them, but they're getting better and better all the time, and things have improved, and so I'll give that a slightly higher score of 7 out of 10. We've gone a long way over the last 20 years in making such systems better. An aspect of modern hearing aids is that they can communicate wirelessly with remote devices, which might be a telephone or a television. And for a mobile phone, the signal can be sent directly to the hearing aid, bypassing the fairly loud speaker in the phone. And this gives improved quality and clarity, especially if you have a closed fitting. If you've got an open fitting, you've still got background sounds leaking through and so on. Another convenience of this approach is that the microphones on the hearing aids can be used to pick up the user's voice and transmits that, so you don't even have to take the phone out of your pocket. Many hearing aids let you just tap on your ear and that turns on the phone signal and you can hold a conversation while driving or whatever without any major problems. There are also a lot now of remote microphone systems where you can place the microphone on a necklace around the person you want to hear or on a table pointing at them. And this can also be helpful for listening to lectures or being in restaurants. And again, it works best with a closed fitting because then you're blocking out the background sounds and you're getting the clean sound coming through these remote microphones. So, score for a closed fitting, I think those systems really work well. For me, it's a great improvement, although mine is not completely closed. For an open fitting, less benefit, but these devices can be really useful, I think, in real practical situations. Although I don't get benefit from binaural hearing, I want to talk a bit about binaural beamformers. People with hearing impairment usually complain that their main problem is understanding speech in noisy situations. And hearing aids alleviate this problem using various forms of noise reduction. One approach is to use the output from 2 or more microphones, or 4 if you're wearing bilateral hearing aids, to create a directional characteristic. And usually the beam is pointed towards the front, although in some systems it can steer towards the most prominent interfering sound. And that can be beneficial if it's possible to look towards the source of interest. Otherwise, it makes the speech-to-background ratio worse. So if you've got a fixed beam pointing to the front and you're looking down at your plate instead of looking at the person you want to hear over there, it's actually making things worse. And if you're at a poster session using one of these highly directional systems, you look away from the presenter at the poster, you've completely lost them. So there's a problem with these, although they can work if you're in a situation where you can look towards the target talker, then they can help. But otherwise, they can make things worse. So the score for a closed fitting is moderate. The score for an open fitting is very low. Those systems really don't help if you've got an open fitting, especially when you can't look towards the person you want to hear. I want to talk now about a more recent development, and this is using noise reduction based on deep neural networks. And these can work either with a single microphone as the input or using 2 or more microphones. And various forms of single microphone noise reduction have been used in hearing aids for many years. They mainly worked by reducing the gain in frequency regions or frequency bands where amplitude modulation patterns characteristic of speech were not detected. So basically, these systems are looking at the patterns of modulation in different frequency bands and attenuating channels that are thought to be dominated by noise. These were of limited effectiveness in the early days, but they've got much better. And recent systems have been using deep neural networks to reduce background noise. And these can be trained in a number of ways. One is to just preserve all speech sounds, but try to attenuate anything that's non-speech. It might be music, it might be steady noise, or whatever. Another approach is to preserve the voice of the most prominent talker and attenuate all other sounds, including other talkers. And I've been using a hearing aid with a DNN of this second type for about 6 months, so I'd like to just say a little bit about my experiences with that hearing aid. Now, my hearing aid is not too bad at low frequency, so I had been using a very open fitting, and with the open fitting, I got a limited benefit from this DNN processing, as you would expect, because in high noise situations, there was too much background sound leaking through the vent. So I tried a closed fitting with a more closed fitting with a small vent, and that led to more occlusion effects. My own voice sounds more boomy and unnatural. I hear more chewing sounds, but it's sort of bearable. And with that, I got much more benefit from the DNN processing. I found it was especially beneficial in a restaurant at a table with 4 people where mainly one person was talking at a time at that table. In a poster session at the last IHCon meeting in Lake Tahoe, where I first tried the device, it was really a big help. And in rooms with high reverberation, the DNN was trained with situations including echoes, and it does reduce echoes. And for me, echoes are a real problem because I only have one ear. I've lost the normal binaural echo suppression. So this could be a big help in those situations. And interestingly, I experienced a paradoxical effect. If I put a finger in the ear to completely block it, so it's like a fully closed system, the speech gets clearer, the benefit gets greater. So the DNN itself does work well in those situations. There's less benefit when you have 2 or more people with similar levels talking at the same time. Then it can't quite decide which one to latch on to. And sometimes, if everybody at your table stops talking, you suddenly start hearing someone talking at the next table. But that doesn't bother me too much. But where it sort of breaks down is if you're at a big table with 10 people and there's lots of cross conversations going, then it's not working so well. So that's a problem for the future. But in some situations, this really makes a big difference. So for an open fitting, a score of 5 out of 10 because you don't really get the benefit at high noise levels. But for a closed fitting, 8 out of 10. I think this represents a good step forward. I want to just say a bit about avenues for dealing with open fit problems. Many hearing aid users are like me. They have only mild hearing loss at low frequencies, and they prefer an open fitting. And it can also help to reduce high humidity in the ear canal that can lead, if you completely block it, you can get infections in the ear canal and so on. Comb filtering with an open fitting the effect is reduced if the aid introduces only a very small time delay, and there's one hearing aid on the market that has a delay of only 0.5 milliseconds, and if in effect that reduces comb filtering, but that limits the type of signal processing you can do. You can't do a lot of fancy noise reduction in half a millisecond. So I think further work is needed on active methods for cancelling occlusion, and also active methods for cancelling sound leaking through the vent, so that if you had an open fitting, you could still get the benefits of the signal processing like DNN processing by cancelling the sound that's leaking through the vent. And this illustrates the type of approach that you can use to do this. In the earpiece, you have a microphone that picks up the sound, but on the side of the part that goes into the ear, you also have a microphone monitoring the sound in the ear canal. And you can use that to effectively cancel sound that's leaking through the vent, and also to cancel internal sounds generated by vibration of the walls of the ear canal. So this is an approach that I think really merits further study and further development. It's a bit more complicated, it requires a bit more signal processing, but it's a way of maintaining listening comfort and the comfort of an open fit while still getting a benefit from directional processing and DNN processing. And this just illustrates in principle the sort of benefits you might get. This is a figure that I took from that paper by Andy Sabin et al., and it just shows how in panel B you've got a mixture of the amplified path and the direct path leaking through the vent. And in panel C, you can see the comb filtering effect that results from that. And panel E shows the effect of reducing the direct path with this active cancellation, and panel F shows the resulting output as a function of frequency, and effectively the comb filtering effect is gone, and you're able to get gain at high frequencies. So I think that's a nice approach to be explored more in the future. It's already done in hearables of various kinds, and of course Apple have produced their earbuds that act like hearing aids, incorporate active noise cancellation of this type, and do pretty much most of the things that hearing aids do, but in a different format. So that's something that the hearing aid manufacturers need to watch out for as a rival approach, but I think it's something that merits more study. So just to give you conclusions, hearing aids have improved markedly over the last 20 years in connectivity, in better directional processing, better feedback cancellation, but I think there's room for improvement in the frequency range they cover, in the way the automatic gain control systems work, and by incorporating active occlusion cancellation and direct sound cancellation, or a mixture of the two. And DNN processing has great potential, but the tough problem of selecting the target talker when you've got several people talking at once remains to be solved, and I think we'll hear more about that from other talkers. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Time for a question? Anybody have a question? That was great, Brian. Thanks. Oh, I thought you were going to ask a question. Are you going to ask any questions for Brian?
Oh, could I ask a question? Over
yeah,
here.
Yeah, please do.
To your right.
Oh, there you are. Yes, sorry. I'm looking.
Yeah, thank you for a great talk. And you know, a lot of us in here are engineers, and we love the technical aspects of the hearing aids and how we can try to compensate for all of the nonlinearities in the cochlea. One of the things that I see sometimes with patients is their brain doesn't adapt to all the fancy electronics that we put into these hearing aids, and sometimes they like a very simple one, like this lyric hearing aid that just kind of goes in there and does almost nothing but just pure amplification. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that and kind of taking advantage of the normal function of the pinna and shape of the ear canal. And maybe,
Yeah, well, there's clearly quite a lot of evidence that if you place the hearing aid microphone in the ear canal, that has some benefit, or at the entrance to the ear canal. It's hard to do directional processing if you have just one microphone in the ear canal. So you trade off the benefits of having two microphones on top to give you a directional characteristic with the natural benefit of the pinna. But I think it's something that needs more explanation. There are a number of studies showing benefits of having the mic at the entrance to the ear canal, or even in the ear canal. And I tried a version of the ear lens device that had a mic at the entrance to the ear canal, and I thought, to me, it was working better than the conventional directional mic. It generally helped a bit. Yeah.
oh, okay, that's great. Did you give the ear lens a score, by the way?
So,
He asked if you gave the ear lens a score.
a score. Well, I give, for basic sound quality, I'd give the ear lens a score of 9 out of 10. In terms of sort of fancy signal processing, lower down, but the AG system was good, but it didn't have very fancy noise reduction, but it had superb basic sound quality.
Well, thank you. Well, this is not on. Yeah. That's surprisingly a great score. Quickly, Stefan, did you have a question? Oh, okay. Okay. Great. Okay, great. Thank you. We'll take more questions later during the Q&A session. Oh, wait. Okay, quickly, go ahead. We do have time, 1 minute.
Hello. You may have mentioned this, so I do apologize in advance, but when you mentioned the limit of compression ratio typically being 3 for other manufacturers, is there a reason for that, such as not including the consumer in the development process, or maybe technological limitations? I know that you mentioned you're able to convince them to go to 17 to 20, but that wouldn't be all manufacturers. So I'm just curious if there's a reason for that.
Why is the compression ratio limited to 3?
Okay,
and why not more?
I think manufacturers limit the compression ratio because there was some data in the literature a long time ago, mainly published by Hans Verschuur and his colleagues and Walter Dreschler, showing that for understanding speech in noise, if you used fast compression with a compression ratio greater than 3, it reduced the intelligibility of the speech. It had bad effects. So it's an empirical observation. And I think that's partly because of this cross-modulation effect that I talked about. Personally, I prefer a system where the compression speed varies with center frequency, and it can be very fast at high frequencies and somewhat slower at low frequencies, but most hearing aids won't let you do that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I tried in the ear lens to make it CF dependent, number of cycles, but
Yeah.
got taken out at some point. Anyway, thank you, Brian. All right, our next speaker is Torsten Dow. There he is. He's a giant stature in our field. Thank you for coming. He's got a very large group at the Technical University of Denmark, and he's going to talk about speech and noise and cocktail party and all kinds of things. I'll let you take over. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much. So, just hide a little bit. So, first of all, Suni, many thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be here and speak at the symposium about, now what I've chosen is about acoustic scene-aware and auditory model-based conversation strategies, which I've prepared together with colleagues Jens Jorke and Tobias May. So, as we've heard before, There are still several key challenges, and the major problem is that hearing impaired people often or still have quite some difficulty with speech communication in adverse conditions. So when there are several speakers at the same time, if there's a vibration present, even though we have really, and we've heard that, there have been quite some achievement over the last 20 years in particular in terms of technology in hearing instruments, but still there are challenges. And this is because we still haven't fully understood what's lost in the impaired system, so what's behind an individual hearing loss, but also what makes the intact, the healthy system so robust. So we would like to understand what's behind that robustness in order to recreate it, of course. And how can we what can we do with hearing instruments to compensate for these deficits? We cannot compensate for lost hair cells or so, not with hearing instruments, but what can we do? And how can we optimize the rehabilitation strategy for the individual, right? That's key. So there's quite some controversy about the best compensation strategy. So the question is, does it make sense to compensate for a hearing loss using biological principles, such as restoring normal function through instantaneous compression, because this is what's happening in the healthy ear, and we lose our instantaneous compression due to outer hair cell loss. Should we follow such principles, or does reconstruction after multi-channel hearing aid compression not maybe, and Brian has mentioned indirectly aspects related to that, do we not introduce more challenges because of distortions than solutions, right? Should we indeed focus on compensation for peripheral hearing, for peripheral impairment, as this is the most common source of the problem? Of course, mostly it originates in the cochlea, not always, but mostly. Should we therefore focus on that aspect? Or should we better prioritize other aspects like central processing, central aspects such as cognitive functions, memory, attention decoding, because we can improve situations, or other component, or would black box statistical machine learning approach, which is not necessarily guided by auditory principles but other principles, would that be maybe a better way to optimize or improve hearing aid design? Or is it maybe a combination of all these things? So in this presentation, I will, in the first part, focus more on the more classical components, so building blocks in hearing instruments, but we'll connect them with some maybe intelligent steering strategies, and we call it scene-aware compensation strategies, using different control or steering signals, but otherwise keeping the strategy of having noise reduction system, compression systems, and so forth. So I will first talk about acoustic scene analysis, where we estimate reverberation, content, and the signal-to-noise ratio to steer a dynamic range compression system. Or I use in the second example audiovisual scene analysis to enable speaker separation. Or in the last example there, we tried brain EEG scene analysis for cognitive control. And we just heard about this problem. Sometimes we would like to know where the action is. What's the speaker of interest? We need to select our focus, right, in order to help. And there are several strategies, and Nima will probably also talk about this later. And then in the second part, in the end, I will talk about auditory model-based compensation strategies, which is typically done in a closed-loop framework, right? And I will have two examples, one designed for combined noise reduction and compensation, which is then more flexible because we don't need the classical building blocks. We could put it together and then use machine learning to optimize it potentially, right? But with a computational target we can define via modeling. And the last example is then another closed-loop framework aimed at predicting perceptual outcomes and solving real-world tasks. So this is then based on perceptual outcomes, not an internal representation after cochlear processing, which I'd like to optimize. No, it's focusing on perceptual outcomes like speech and ability and others, but in a model framework. So hearing loss, of course, can be complex. We have loss of sensitivity as only one aspect of the consequence of hearing loss. And this audiogram shown here can have various forms, and of course, various factors, underlying factors, contribute even to differences in sensitivity. So like neural components, sensory factors, or metabolic processes or elements which contribute to that. but of course contribute also to enormous differences in suprathreshold deficits. That's often even more important, of course, and relevant in terms of loudness perception, spectral-temporal resolution, spatial perception, and in particular speech perception. And conceptually, some model-based, conceptual approaches based on Plomb and others have described these different factors like more conceptually as attenuation, distortion, or neural components, and linked to that different of these perceptual consequences like increased thresholds, of course, but also loss of sensitivity, and in particular dynamic range compression and reduced frequency selectivity, and the neural component here, which is linked to increased susceptibility to noise and other aspects. And then there have been traditionally different rehabilitation strategies like frequency-specific amplification and frequency compression, but also AGC, and we heard about this in Brian's talk, multiband dynamic range compression, spectral enhancement, and others. So as you know, of course, and we all expect, to compensate for hearing loss, we need to restore short-term audibility. We would like to do this on a short-term scale to be sensitive to changes in time, of course, and also want to compensate loudness. And, well, therefore, we typically amplify more at low sound pressure levels and amplify less at high sound pressure levels. This is effectively equivalent to having a compressive system, right? And, well, the origin, also the loss of compression, is typically coming from the loss of fast-acting instantaneous, actually physiological dynamic range compression of muscle membrane movement due to outer hair cell loss. And ideally, this should be addressed with correspondingly fast-acting multiband dynamic range compression in hearing instruments. This sounds kind of plausible, but the problem is the success is very limited. So even advanced and instantaneous frequency-sensitive processing schemes provide only very limited benefit. I don't go into details here. This is speech inaudibility as a function of certain spatial arrangement of signals and maskers, and there's essentially no benefit here using such an advanced kind of instantaneous frequency-specific processing, which otherwise sounds attractive because we try to mimic or try to reflect actual biological principles in hearing and which we lose, and we try to reintroduce it, but it doesn't help in many cases, right? So and there are similar challenges with other auditory processing schemes which are inspired by, for example, auditory filter bandwidth, which is increased in people with hearing loss, and then one can apply, of course, spectral enhancement strategies. But if you do that inspired by auditory models, it often doesn't work. So there are a number of perceptual consequences of fast-acting compression. Still, we want fast-acting compression because we would like to be sensitive to fast changes in the acoustic environment. So the pros are a fast gain recovery after high-intensity stimulation, so which leads to improved audibility, improved recovery from forward masking, improved listening in the dips, this is all fine, and also more effective compression of speech. But there are many challenges also. Brian mentioned some of them. So there's a reduction of spectral contrast, there's disruption of temporal cues, there's reduced temporal envelope fidelity, and also modulation spectrum changes, typically in connection to fast-acting compression. So it's really important to connect the operations on the stimulus statistics we introduce to the auditory feature statistics that underlie perception. So, and those perception aspects we are interested in, which are crucial for us, like speech ability, spatial hearing, and other aspects. So we need to understand the link, because otherwise just dynamic range compression may help in some aspects, but it messes up a number of other things, potentially. So we thought about that, and this is some processing which is not inspired by auditory processing principles directly, only indirectly. So if we could combine fast-acting compression in terms of effective compression of speech components of interest, so to speak, but could avoid, let's say, or reduce the distortions here due to the processing. So here we see speech signal here on the right, and let's say we use a fast-acting system here switched on, which leads to a gain function indicated here. So the gain is large, of course, in both phases where there's low energy here, and so forth. And this leads to then, because we amplify these, let's say, little reverberant low-intensity portions, which are boosted, reduced to that, and this leads then to some boosted activity here, which is potentially not so great, right? If we would instead then estimate binary speech activity based on short-term estimates of the direct to reverberant ratio, then we could apply fast-acting compression to the speech-dominant portions and linearize the system in the other portions, right, where there's not dominated by speech. And this would then lead to such a compressor, which is a dual compressor, switches between fast and slow compression, and then leads to something which is, of course, with a gain, which changes here accordingly, and which might lead to, again, a better output where you have compression in the relevant phases and more linearized processing in those pauses, right? So does it really matter, such a processing? Yes, it can matter. Of course, it depends on the particular arrangements of the settings, compression ratio, compression threshold, and so forth. But what we did here was a very simple experiment where we have virtualized sounds coming from different directions, but via, so to speak, as a virtual impulse, binary room impulse responses, and then also implementing some hearing aid compression in this virtualized world. And then people will simply ask on their iPad, so to speak, to say, where did the presented sound come from which direction, with or without compression, in a room which was very moderately reverberant. And it turns out that if you have linear processing, there's no distortion, of course, then people are reasonably accurate and in terms of localization. But if you switch fast compressor, when it's messing up things, even for this trivial task of just saying where the sound was coming from in a little moderately reverberant condition, it messes up with split images and all over the place here, at least with those settings. If you switch on this direct reverberant aware ratio, aware compressor, then it fixes it. It comes close to the linear processing here, and also in the ideal where we knew everything beforehand with the Oracle information. So this helps pretty well. And also one of the consequences, if you analyze that, is that fast compression, even when binarily linked, right, if you switch the compressors, we link them, even then it disrupts binary statistics. It just changes the interoral coherence, even normal hearing listeners. This plot looks even more messy if you look at the results from hearing impaired people. So, and there are several, you can use the same principle, it's just a principle to estimate speech portions. This is a speech signal here, a noisy speech signal, and you can estimate the speech portions using also machine learning principles. And then it turns out that if you switch a fast-acting compressor in those speech phases here, dominated in these blue areas, and you then apply linear processing in the pauses or in those segments more dominated by noise, a low-level noise, then you achieve higher speech intelligibility compared to slow-acting compression, also compared to purely fast-acting compression, and higher preference scores as well. And in another, a more complex study, we looked at also called scene-aware compression, where we had actually not only compression but also noise, direct noise reduction system here. So we looked at speech and noise and as a noisy and reverberant conditions, and combined a single-channel noise reduction system and a foreground to background noise ratio aware compression, and considered their combined processing, in particular here on preference ratings, because often it's argued that fast-acting compression is maybe good for intelligibility, but doesn't work for quality. People don't like it because it's distorted, right? But this is not per se right, because if you switch this fast-acting compression in a smart way, then it doesn't mess up the preference. So here, this is on the left, the low preference scores as expected for the fast-acting system. If you combine it with single-channel noise reduction, it increases here. But if you combine single-channel noise reduction with the scene-aware compression, then it really gives much better preference. The preference is also good in the slow-acting system. That's fine in terms of preference, but that doesn't work for speech intelligibility because it's way too slow, right? So this is kind of maybe trivial in some way, but it's nevertheless intriguing. So there are, of course, a number of limitations. For example, you need robust detection of the target activity. You need that information. You need to know where is the target of interest, right? So it could be challenging with this concept for multi-channel or multi-talker mixtures, and how is it can we reliably identify the target? So I get back to this in a minute. And also otherwise, when we have these building blocks like noise reduction and compression, they typically don't go together very well. So the signal noise ratio is increased in one, and the other one decreased, and it's not necessarily with these building blocks, it's a challenge in itself. Nevertheless, there are perspectives because it turns out that some hearing impaired listeners benefit from fast-acting compression, particularly those that have a high working memory capacity. So that's also interesting to keep in mind. The question is, of course, if one could combine this strategy here, this processing, with a cognitively steered selection of the target of interest. This is still what pops up again and again. If you would know that, this would also help here, right? And then later on, can we actually also generalize or improve, optimize the combination of noise reduction and dynamic range compression in a network? So what about then audiovisual control? This is one option to help select the relevant target, right? So let's say this guy hears in particular two voices here from these two people, and maybe he's more interested in what she is saying, and that's the red functions are the envelopes, so to speak. So how can we now, so to speak, extract that one compared to the other one? Well, if a system could learn to extract visual features of a talking face, and those features that are correlated with the corresponding audio, then one could use this information in principle as a hint and isolate the target speech. That would be kind of smart, right? So we tried that. We used deep learning strategies to estimate 3D facial landmarks in various video frames, so trained that, and then used CCA, so canonical correlation analysis, to learn the maximum correlations between the visual features and the auditory envelope features, right? So we have the auditory domain here on the top with a waveform, and then we do, as always, the spectral filtering, Hilbert envelope as extraction, and then some modulation filtering, and then some summation across bands to make it more robust. And then we have in the visual domain, I don't hear sound. There should be sound, anyways, as well. But and that's the 3D facial landmarks. This doesn't work as well. That's a pity. So there is a face moving, and no, okay. And these then are explored in X, Y, and Z axis, and then we look at the correlation between these moving visual features and the auditory envelope patterns, right? And so if you do it and then look at, so to speak, how do these features look like, so to speak, the modulation transfer functions of audio-visual speech, not of audio speech, not of visual, of audio-visual speech, then you can see, as expected, there are some correlations in the 3 to 4 hertz domain due to our, the mouth movements, mouth openings. That's not surprising, but there's also a dominant element of 1 to 2 hertz activity, visual activity, which relates to global face and head motions, which are apparently pretty prominent in conversations and can be utilized also here to use such visual cues in a speech separation network. So if you have a mixed waveform here, and then with corresponding spectrogram, and you use these visual hints, then you can use this information as a mask, so to speak, to enhance the spectrogram and to provide pretty good audiovisual speech separation. And this can be even improved in a nonlinear way using extensions of this canonical correlation analysis. I will not show the audio demo here. But of course, also this is not more than just a proof of concept. There are challenges, and of course, this can be combined in principle with the scene-aware compression I discussed before. But there are latency issues. The visual cues are slow, networks are huge, and there are delays for real-time implementation. So I don't know how far we can get there. Also, we only use stationary videos, and if we would use head-mounted dynamic cameras, so to speak, this would introduce more noise and all these things, and also it's unclear how to maintain spatial cues. So it's just the first step here. And also, would people eventually really run around with and adopt glasses that record video and run around with this? I don't know. I wouldn't, maybe. But maybe if it really helps, then one would. Okay, but we could also go further. We would say, okay, audiovisual cue, we don't want to watch at one person. Maybe we would do it even more elegantly. Why not steering it via cognitive control, via our brain and via EEG signals, right? That would be pretty nice. We tried that with colleagues in Europe, so from Zurich, Paris, London, and also together with Oticon in Denmark. So if we had microphones again in the space, so to speak, to do some acoustic pre-processing, scene analysis, then we still need to select the source of interest. So again, the same thing, we would like to select the cause of the person of interest, but this time via EEG, so brain EEG. And this is based on the great idea based on this paper from Sullivan more than 10 years ago, exploring speech-brain synchronization. So we have the audiogram here, and we have multi-channel EEG here, then there's encoding model here, and the decoding processing here, and the decoding strategy is then to find a filter to reconstruct the speech, so to speak here, from the multi-channel EEG. And this is typically done via regression. And the problem is, of course, this is a nice idea, it works in simple concepts or conditions, but can we use EEG-controlled brain-computer interfaces? So can single-trial EEG attention decoding actually serve robustly as a user control signal? And this is now, has just come out here after, I don't know, ages to implement the thing, and it's a first closed-loop system, actually, that works. But we started, the whole thing was more on the research, so to speak. Is this idea, is it actually robust in real rooms? So where we have noise, where we have reverberation, does it really work, or is it only with headphone experiments in direct conditions, right? And it actually does, so there is, this decoding accuracy is pretty large and also pretty unaffected in normal hearing listeners, in the first place here, by the conditions, whether it's dry, a low reverberation room, high reverberation condition, or even cocktail party setup. If this target, the focus is the task to focus on one listener versus the other listener, right? And then to decode, attention decode, or steer a beamformer using that signal we read out, then it works reasonably well. It's not so much affected by reverberation. It was surprising, right? But then the question is, of course, does it work for hearing impaired people? Can it work? Because we know it's disrupted. The internal representation is disrupted. What reaches the brain is disrupted. So is it not hopeless? Right? But it was surprisingly stable there, so to speak. If you look at classification accuracy here, then you see that in hearing impaired people, of course, they had some amplification in order to hear anything, but it was only linear amplification, nothing else. So it's still distortions in the system to be assumed. But the decoding accuracy was higher in hearing impaired, not much, but a little bit, than if so, than in them and not in the others. So decoding accuracy tends to be even higher than in normal hearing listeners, which is interesting, maybe logical, because, well, we see an enhanced envelope representation hearing impairment. This couldn't be partially, or because we know we lose compression in the inner ear, we have some type of linearized processing, we have central gain, I don't know what, we have higher representations as a fingerprint, so to speak, and high up here, but this is not correlated, or this does not reflect any aspect of, for example, speech and noise recognition benefit. These are two different things. We have maybe increased activity, but it doesn't help, it doesn't represent the challenge they actually experience in speech and noise. So this is nice and all interesting. We often deal with hearing loss, but how is this reflected and related to the actual, the challenge we want to help with, right? And just to show, I don't know, so this is the system we implemented then with a microphone array and then the beamformer eventually, right? And then the attention decoder here via EEG when we focus on one of those speakers. And I don't know if it works. It doesn't? This is annoying. This is a nice demo, right? So I checked it yesterday in this room there, and now it doesn't work. Terrible. Okay. Well, talk to me afterwards. I'll show it to you. It's a pity. It's really, these people talk, and then the one who is raising their hand, this is the person, the listener here on the right, should focus on and switches, and then within a few seconds, actually, you have this amplified sound due to purely attention decoding. It's quite impressive. So it works. It works. It takes 5 seconds, way too long to be interesting for applications, right? So it's not really interesting for applications, I would say, at the moment, but it works in principle, which I did not expect scientifically, so to speak. But it's noisy. It's the question is what is accurate attention decoding and so forth. There's also many questions, and also this BCI challenge. But sometimes there's always if you have 85% decoding accuracy, that sounds high, or even 90. But but if in 10% of the cases you don't recognize a bus coming from the right, so this is not acceptable anyways. So in the end, I would like to have the other loop, so to speak. So far we used traditional hearing aid processing blocks, so to speak, relying on these building blocks like dynamic range compression, noise reduction, beamforming, which is all fine. And while it's relatively straightforward to define ground truth in terms of noise reduction, because ground truth is the clean signal, right? This is less clear in connection to dynamic range compression, where you, with this model approach here, we could define a definitive computational target, right? So that's a problem with dynamic range. That's a problem with dynamic range compression because we don't know what is ground truth where. We know for noise reduction there's a clean signal which is a target, but for dynamic range compression it's not so clear. And you could use auditory models and then establish a computational target like the internal representation of a normal hearing model. So it has been, we will hear talks later on, Sarah and others. So for example, using a DNN, which has been trained in a closed loop framework to minimize the difference between, so to speak, the normal hearing and hearing impaired representations after some, for example, in this case, cochlear model. And then the resulting loss function here on the right guides then the development of a pre-processing strategy to bridge this gap and to minimize this difference, right? And there are recent, very interesting approaches, and there's still challenges, I would say. In which way is it adjustable to individuals? Is it real-time time capable, and so forth? So I have only 2 slides here in the end to show 2 examples of model-based kind of compensation strategies, different to what I presented in the first part, which was not necessarily auditory model-based, but more, let's say, classically and acoustic scene-aware driven. So here, instead of combining, here in this case here, we could use the same strategy of the model, right? And now we combined, so to speak, noise reduction and compensation. So hearing loss, compensation, compression strategies here in one step using a multitask learning problem. That's now pretty nice. You can combine them, can even create 2 loss functions and in a framework here to control joint noise reduction, hearing loss compression, and hearing loss compensation, and can do it in a balanced way during inference. So we can switch between either going more towards noise reduction or compensation, because some people prefer one or the other. This can be done in this framework compared to the typical framework where it's only done for one or the other, typically. And what is here different in our approach compared to others is that our auditory model we used here is a simpler one, so less complex than, for example, the more realistic auditory nerve representations in some of the more complex models. It's also differentiable, and it's a simplified version of the model shown here. And to be short here, just we can find that, so to speak, for a certain mixing parameter between these 2 systems here, you can find some optimized values for Husky, which expresses quality score, which is interesting. And also otherwise, it seems that this kind of system, particularly with the benefit of balancing between denoising and compression, is an interesting tool. And we are not stuck anymore to the 2 building blocks. We can put it together, use machine learning to kind of derive the maximum or an optimum. So lately, and the last thing here is what I call perceptual outcome-based approach. Here the idea is instead of compensating for differences in, for example, relatively peripheral internal representations, model-based, the idea would be to compensate for differences in predicted perceptual outcome measures. So perceptual outcome measures which are more related to behavior and not to intermediate representation in a model, like the cochlea. So this could be one of these. This is a model I've been working on myself, which has been used in the past to predict speech and noise perception, to predict intelligibility, but also resolution limits in the spectral domain and temporal domain, which has been quite successful there. But it was based on an ideal observer concept, so to speak, in specific conditions, of course, here and there. It is primarily stimulus-driven. It is purely bottom-up process. It's a task, it's completely task blind, so to speak. It lacks central task dependent mechanism, so it has a number of limitations. It doesn't know what speech is, but nevertheless it has been powerful on a signal processing point of view to predict these many outcome measures. But there have been, and this is the topic of course also today, incredible advances with deep learning. And it has been shown that by optimizing networks to learn hierarchical feature transformation for real-world tasks, for example, we can achieve quite a bit. Of course, these networks are substantially deeper because multi-layered networks and richer in that sense. And then this simple model I have used, which could be characterized maybe with 2 layers, right? So it's much richer. But in principle, this approach here could be generalized here with hearing processing here steered via the predicted outcome here. And this model here now uses deep layers here and has been shown by Mark Sadler and Josh McDermott that this approach trained on real-life sound scenarios can predict a number of other outcomes here in a impressive way. And on top of it, which is presented at this ARO also, it can be shown that the same network learned through these ecologically valid conditions is able to predict also, let's say, psychophysical data, more classical ones, like modulation tuning, without having implemented a modulation filter bank, which I've used 20 years or whatever, or years to develop. So in principle, you can go there via machine learning, learn through all sorts of features, and it's spitting it out, so to speak. It's fascinating, frustrating at the same time, right? But it gives enormous potential for moving on. You could, for example, use investigate perceptual consequences of hearing loss by changing the trained model's simplified peripheral input here, and can study the consequence of hearing loss on these natural sound aspects, including also the classical psychophysical data. So, summary, I have discussed different approaches to 2 aspects. One was acoustic scene-aware processing and auditory model-inspired compensation strategies with really various different philosophical approaches, leveraging more or less deep networks to enhance output performance. So I at first had this machine learning-based networks for estimating steering signals to enhance traditional hearing aid functions, right? Like estimating direct-to-reverberant ratio and signal-to-noise ratio for scene-aware compression, not introduced, inspired by auditory processing, but more acoustic scene analysis and so. Then identifying the target speaker in audiovisual source separation applications and detecting the target speaker through cognitive control. And second, I looked at the model-based closed-loop compensation strategies using machine learning based as networks to define a computational target. Then we can optimize this, at least that's the idea, right? Moving beyond traditional building blocks. We can put things together and maybe find elegant new solutions. And I showed two examples. One looking at the distance between peripheral internal representations for normal hearing impairment, and one was based on predicted outcome measures, like speech perception and others. And I would like to end with also using the idea of using machine learning-based networks to predict perceptual outcomes in a forward model. So, of course, we want the whole loop, but it's nevertheless crucial to be able to predict, so to speak, relevant outcome measures in order to understand what is the effect of hearing loss within this framework, what is the effect also of hearing aid processing in the predicted, so to speak, outcome. If we can do that, we understand quite a bit, and of course, this is then relevant also for the closed loop, but it's valuable in itself. And maybe we can do it combining knowledge we have, so to speak, as boundary conditions from psychophysics and other, combined with machine learning to get a higher predictive power overall. Thank you very much for your time and for your interest.
Time for a question? Any questions for Thorsten? I know there's somebody over there.
Hi, thank you. That was such a fascinating talk. I was wondering about the audiovisual integration. So this is a slower time scale, the gestures and the movements. I was wondering, is it possible to then go to the faster time scale and use like voice characteristics to do the same kind of tracking? You track performance spacing or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't tried that. I think it's possible. I don't know how fast we can, so as far as we used, there was a pretty complicated network, neural network, and it would probably work, but I don't know how smooth it would work in an actual real system using that, so to speak. I don't know, we haven't tried that.
Okay, thanks.
Just one more question, go ahead.
Hello. Great talk. Thank you so much. Just a naive question. I was just wondering if that correlation that you see between the visual cues and the audio cues are seen as well in other languages.
Oh, I think because, I mean, we haven't tested, let's say, we have tested this only in, I think it was Danish, of course, but because there are so many characteristics that are very similar, the main features, right? I mean, maybe in other cultures, I don't know how the gesture looks like, but let's say, I would say for most languages, the acoustic features are pretty similar, and also visual connections are, I would say that would not be fundamentally different.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. So we're running a little bit behind, but let's come back at 10:15, for the part 2 of this hearing aid symposium. Thanks, everyone.